Welcome, everyone, to the 2024 Exposure Validation Briefing. My name is Ron Eddings, and I'll be your host for this session that is being brought to you by Pika Security and Hacker Valley Media. It would mean the world to us if you liked, followed, or shared this session to someone that you think could benefit from it. And we're here because one of the driving forces that brings us here is reducing the exposure to security risks. Time and time again, we find some vulnerabilities and exposures, and we think we fixed them, but we learn that we really did not. Gartner recently shared a quote and said, by 2026, organizations that prioritize their security investments based on continuous threat exposure management will be 3 times less likely to suffer a breach. How amazing would it be to reduce your risk to breach that significantly? Our panel, they're here to help you overcome some of this challenge, and I'd love to introduce you to them. Our first panelist is Cecil Pineda, CISO at R1 and also co-founder of CISO XC. Our next panelist is Ed Bellis, founder of Kenna Security and also a legendary leader in vulnerability management. And last but not least, we also have Volkan Ertuk, co-founder and CTO of Pika Security. Welcome to the briefing, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Great to be here.
Yes, it is great to be speaking to you all. Let's go ahead and jump right in. I think it would be best to start off with doing a little bit of an assessment of how we got here in the first place. Ed, you've done some great work, especially through founding Kenna Security. I feel like everyone has heard of or used that tool before, getting acquired by Cisco. So tell us a little bit about the history of vulnerability management and how we got to where we are today with having more than we can respond to.
Sure. I like to think of vulnerability management as kind of the stages of pain, right? So the stage 0 was kind of ignorance is bliss. And this was way back on 20 plus years ago. And nobody really knew what vulnerabilities they had, but assumed that everything was good. They started to get more into vulnerability assessment, and you started to see some of the tools come out, and like the Nessus, and people were scanning with some of the open source scanners back then. And they started to find more vulnerabilities, and that whole kind of area of security started to beef up, and you saw the emergence of Qualys and Rapid7 and all these, and people started to figure out, oh my God, not only do I have vulnerabilities, they're all over the place, right? So what do I do now? Because I don't have the resources to fix everything that they're showing me here. And so that's kind of where Kenna originally came in. And what we did was basically look at all of your vulnerabilities, start to look at the attacks and the telemetry there that we could see across the internet, which vulnerabilities were being exploited, which ones were weaponized, what was the volume and velocity of those exploitations, marrying that up against your own environment to say, well, this one is much more likely to be exploited in your environment than this one. However, that was stage 2 maybe that we were at by then, right? And now we're at the point where it's, yeah, that's great. And that tells me a little bit about how likely a vulnerability is to be attacked or exploited across the internet. But what about me? What about my environment? What about my controls? What do I have in place that maybe I've got a firewall rule in place or something in my IPS or my endpoint protection that actually protects me against that exploit. Yes, it's vulnerable technically, but there's other controls in place. So we started now to start to see more of the kind of the validation that we're starting to see, and we'll talk a lot about, I think, on this session ourselves.
When I worked as a security architect, I did some vulnerability management, and I thought, taking a step back, in a few years, we'll have way less vulnerabilities that everyone's responding to. And everyone that I speak to says the opposite. Okay. Cecil, you are CISO, you're a CISO at a very large company. Is vulnerability management, is that one of those things that has spiraled for you as well?
Yeah. And it's an area that's, Ed used the word pain. It's very painful for many organizations, especially for an organization that grew by acquisition. And if you have a massive environment, our technology footprint is enormous. And as you can just imagine, great topic. Again, yeah, it's something that many CISOs across different industries are worried today. Just today, we have a meeting tomorrow to discuss, hey, what's our prioritizations for all of these vulnerabilities.
You also have CISO Exceed. I'm sure you speak to a lot of different CISOs across, especially the Dallas area, let alone other cities. What have you been hearing from the community on vulnerability management and the current state?
Well, unfortunately, many organizations are still in the traditional scan, remediate, go back, scan again. It's inefficient. It's old. It's inefficient. It's outdated. I'm not a big fan of jargons, but CTEM is probably I'm a fan of this. And this is something that I think every large organization CISO should adopt.
So Vulcan, I'm sure for you, this is a unique perspective because, PICAS has many different capabilities, some on, the breach and attack simulation side. I'm sure there was a trend or a pattern, especially doing breach and attack simulation and seeing the same things exposed over and over and over again. And if you type in CTEM into Google, PICAS security is one of the first things that pop up. I think that you all really understood that continuous threat exposure management isn't just one thing, it's how well you do a variety of things. So tell us a little bit about, your experience and what you're seeing in the vulnerability management space and how it's evolving.
Sure. From day one, we established PICAS. We always get a question like, hey guys, you're doing breach attack simulation, you're the pioneer. So if we implement this technology and introduce a process, is it replacing the vulnerability management program? We're saying that, no, it's not replacing, it's complementary. So we have been definitely working with the vulnerability management companies and with our clients as part of their vulnerability management process. What I see is that very parallel to what Ed mentioned from the phase 2 that is he named. Definitely everyone has more mature vulnerability management program over time. But what we also see recently as following other best practices, now organizations are introducing not a better vulnerability assessment coverage, but they are looking other types of findings. What I see is that non-exploitable findings, like also we can tell it like misconfigurations or gaps in their environments. Breach attack simulation is one of that. External attack surface management or cyber attack surface management and test automation, they're all introducing additional findings into their practice security program, let's say. So what I see is that when we work with our clients, we see they have different pipelines. Here is our vulnerability management process. Here is our BAS process. Here is our ESM process. So that we see that they're really juggling with multiple processes, and that is definitely not scaling. So what I see is that with the CTEM, with the exposure management or proactive security, definitely we are now normalizing that multiple lines of management processes into a single process, which looks really promising.
I'm really rooting for CTEM, that acronym. I know that Gartner, they give out a lot of acronyms. Some are very helpful. And I used to work in the ASM space, attack surface management. I'm actually working on a book on the subject now. And everyone would get confused when they would hear EASM and then CASM. Just trying to explain attack surface management as a whole now became that much more difficult. But for continuous threat exposure management, it's like all encompassing. There's so many things that you have to do in order to, do it well. But it's a journey. It's a continuous process that you have to keep on evolving and maturing. And CISO, I'm sure for you, having such a wide reach in the CISO community, you might hear, hey, is this a good term? Should I be using this term? What is your thoughts on using that term CTEM? Is that something that you could see, sticking and resonating well with CISOs?
Yes, I think it's going to stick. And actually, a few days ago, one of the CISOs from the Dallas area brought the idea on, hey, how can we manage vulnerabilities? How can we do risk quantification? How can we get better at doing vulnerability management? And I think it's going to stick. But I want to follow up on Vulcan's. We are doing bits and pieces of these L components of CTEM as modular. We're doing vulnerability management separately. We're doing breach and attack separately. We're doing all these different things. Even risk quantification is something we would like to do better. There's so many ways of risk quantification. I would like us to, as an industry, to develop a standard way of risk quantification, because CVSS is helpful, but it's not, as Ed mentioned earlier, there's so many elements you need to consider, the velocity of the exploits, the location of the device, if it's internet facing, is it in your network or where your crown jewels are located? So there's so many. So we really, as an industry, I think we need to standardize on how we, measure this, risk, and also going away from modular to a more CTEM approach, whatever that looks like.
Let's talk about it. Let's jump in, because if you go to Gartner or many different resources on exposure management, let alone CTEM, the first stage is scoping.
Yeah.
And I think that when you think about scoping, that can mean so much. So Ed, Vulcan, like what goes into that initial scoping and maybe even a little bit of the discovery phase as well?
It's funny because it's the first stage. Of course, it's the first stage for that. And then when you look at like the CIS critical controls, they say, well, the number one critical control is know your assets. Oh, okay, yeah, easy enough. Just know my assets. But as you know, as someone who has been in the ASM space, right, there's a lot of assets that you never know, and they're constantly changing. And the bigger your organization is and the bigger of a footprint you have, the bigger flux that there always is. And then, so being able to just either know your assets or scope out what your CTEM program should encompass is huge. It's an ever changing, ever evolving part of the process, right? You're just constantly going through that. And then I would add to it, one of the things that we used to see all the time back at Kenna was we would pull in that data from your attack surface management, especially your external attack surface management tools. And they put all this in and say, okay, we found these new assets that looks like they belong to us. They've got these vulnerabilities on them. We should fix them. Great. Who owns this machine? I have no idea. Who has access to patch all these vulnerabilities? I have no idea. Right. So it's not nearly as easy of a problem as it's made out to sound, especially whether you're working with analyst firms or it's kind of put out there. And it's I'm a big believer in incremental improvements, right? You're constantly just adding to it, and then you're figuring some things out, and you might add a process here that helps you kind of discover who might actually have that or own that asset. So I don't know that there's a magical bullet around complete discovery, but there's certainly bits and pieces that fit within a CTEM program.
But what I can also add is definitely there are also edge cases. What I generally here in the field is like, it's great to looking into to put all the assets in a single dashboard, but then we are always start talking about the discrepancies. So we are getting these assets from ESM, but we don't know what these assets in our environment. Or BAS is reporting about controls, but controls are not necessarily mapped to assets. We are getting some findings from pentest automation. How can we overlay on that? So actually, what we generally see, like everyone has the idea, hey, we need to put everything together. But currently, what the organizations are juggling is they have multiple dashboards, and I call them islands of information, and they are trying to run their operations with those islands of information, because trying to make them together, some I see, so like building middlewares, their own dashboards in a SIM solution or like Tableau kind of solutions. And they're spending a lot of time and effort into that, and they're just getting very little or very limited outcome. So I see some are getting tired.
I agree, Vulcan, and I would argue we're not talking about single panes of glass. We're talking about this data, more context, right? So having additional context from different data points will be the key for everybody's getting their job done correctly. And at this point, maybe we're better off actually just implementing this firewall rule over here versus patching 35.7 million vulnerabilities. We don't know. But I think that context is key. I think data sharing is super important. In fact, I would say we're just talking about CTEM and exposures and kind of the preventative side of things. but we would benefit from the data that sits on the detection and response side of the tooling as well, right? If things are coming in from your XDR and EDR and NDR and all the firewall logs and your SIM or whatever the case might be, knowing what is being attacked on my network is going to help me prioritize. And the other way around, right? Knowing what I'm vulnerable to is certainly going to help people in the SOC in terms of how they respond to different things that they're seeing.
Exactly. So it definitely, like, from the day one, Gartner talked about exposure management. They said this is a program. There shouldn't be a CTEM product. So I never imagined that there will be a product that is covering all the process, that is the silver bullet to make this happen. I also think very parallel at what you said. This is a synergy. It's like a team sport. We need to have an open platform that multiple vendors not consuming data from each other, doing their stuff. They need to also ingest data to each other so that we can iterate with two-way conversation between those technologies.
One can dream though of that single place. And I like what y'all are all saying, like find the use case and build around that. Don't try to just have one thing fits all. I mean, I think that kind of goes back to, the steps that go into scoping and discovery for this continuous threat exposure management process. Maybe one of you all or everyone could break down what goes into it. What are the things that I should do in the first 30 days if I'm scoping or in my discovery phase of CTEM?
The asset context is really key. I would really start with focusing on assets and making sure that I measure them based on their criticality to the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I've also heard it coined as asset intelligence. And Ed, it makes me think of you because Kenna was one of the first products I've seen that kind of pulled in and married asset and vulnerability management data.
If you had some vulnerabilities, some internet exposed vulnerabilities sitting on an asset that was really important to our business or central to some sort of financial process or something, that's obviously going to affect how I prioritize remediation efforts as well. It's one of those things where it gets so complex in the real world and you start to think about all of the different ways that I could prioritize assets. So I could go and look at, well, this is our public website, but it's mostly marketing material. It's brochureware. It's public information. We want the world to have it, right? So maybe it's not that bad if we get compromised until somebody actually uploads malware and you are now serving to your customer all this malware directly. And now you've got a world of hurt because you've infected all of your customers. So you might have to look at it to Cecil's point, not only from this is really sensitive data, but who has access to it? How many people have access to it, right? If I got millions of users that are coming to this, maybe it's more important than you think, even if there is no sensitive data.
Yeah. It could be serving malware, Ed.
Very good. Very well.
It could be. It sounds like that's happened before, but we won't get into any of that. But it would be great to hear a story, especially from Ed or Vulcan on what have you seen as one of those success stories when someone's going through those initial phases of building out exceptional vulnerability management or looking into the future, like looking at exposure management?
We have been working closely with the exposure management processes organizations are into, because vulnerability management processes and everything was in the market for the last 10 years. So no one is looking into how we can look into our vulnerability management, but everyone is asking about the exposure management part. So I'm also a very agile person. As a company, we are following all the agile practices, as also Ed mentioned. I believe very parallel. We need to run in small circles. So it shouldn't be like, hey, let's do the scoping. We did the scoping. Great. Let's do the discovery. We did the discovery. Okay, 6 months later, let's look at the prioritization. Let's do prioritization. No, it doesn't work that way, because like you build those pieces, and when you introduce the other piece, the previous pieces will not fit into that one. So you need to go back and shape that one. If you spend 6 months, reshaping that one will take additional 3 months. So you lose a lot. It's a new process. The best practices are not there. Not many organizations are very successful, and they're not publishing their use cases, their learnings. So in such cases, when you have more unknowns, when you have more risk, I believe baby steps is important and agile process is important. We work closely a couple of financial institutions and a critical infrastructure in parallel to adapt to migrate their vulnerability management process to their exposure management process. And we are also supporting with our tooling, as we have lots we are doing in our roadmap. So we are also developing our tool set, products, modules in parallel to their needs to better understand how well the market is shaping there. So you choose a limited scope, then you see what are the data sources you have, because you're going to see some missing items. Oh, I have missing vulnerable scanner data. Let me do that one. 2 months left. So you may want to say like, okay, next year we're going to have a renewal. So we want to move into this requirement set. So it will be a nice process to also build how you want to have your security stack moving forward. That is the ballpark we see in the emerging clients.
The best way to move Mount Everest is piece by piece.
That's right. There's something about eating an elephant in there too. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Vulcan, and I would say the best success stories that we saw over the time were always start small and incrementally improve and expand your scope and set your target, your next target, and then go out and meet that target and then set the next target a little bit further out.
So Vulcan, you said something. You said there was vulnerability management, but it's exposure management. Is that the consensus? Is vulnerability management really a term that we should move beyond and focus on exposure management along with other things?
Yeah, 100%. Generally, vulnerability is coined with CVEs or CWEs, but there are lots of findings that are non-exploitable, and there maybe doesn't have a CV or a CWE. So we need to really extend our definition. So exposure means that, hey, we are not looking into the vulnerability scope. We have a like bigger scope there. So that's the reason I'm a believer of exposure concept, because it just helps us to think out of box, not anchor the old vulnerability management process we have, because now we need to manage a lot. So it helps us think out of the box.
I have one question, Vulcan. I know it's probably not vulnerable today, but what if it's tomorrow? You kind of put that asset at the bottom of the list, and then the next day, it's being exploited by APT35.
Yeah. You see exploits changing all the time. We would see a sudden spike in that. I also agree with you, Vulcan, that I think exposure is a better general term, just because when people hear vulnerability, they often think about CVEs. Whether it's posture management, exposure management, whatever the case might be, it could be a vulnerability. It could be a misconfiguration. It could be the lack of a security control, right? A public S3 bucket with some sensitive data, and it isn't a vulnerability per se, but it could be very important in terms of my overall risk, depending on what's there.
And it's like we're not allowed to sleep anymore. We have to watch everything now.
Yeah, exactly. That's
no more sleep for you.
That's not ideal. Yeah, I guess that's also a problem with the exposure management that we need to discuss, because when we are doing vulnerability assessment, Ron, I don't know, maybe we are derailing the conversation. Jump in if we stop the question. But, the way we do vulnerability assessment is, hey, give me access to every system. So from every port, I need to reach them, and give me a user with admin rights, so I can really do white box assessment. So we get all the findings without any security controls. So we list them, and we think that, okay, these are our risky items, but then we never overlay the security controls on that. So maybe it's like a device that is not published from port 83 or 8445. So, but you have an app there. So maybe, or you have an IPS that is blocking, or you have an EDR that's great, is already blocking that technique. So somewhere, definitely to have a good coverage of vulnerability assessment, we need that exclusions, but somewhere we need to also augment the vulnerability findings, because it's not fair. The exposure management is here to create an edge and help organizations to think through that, and motivating vendors to work together, to connect those information silos.
It's a good point. That's a good point. Cecil bought all those security controls for a reason, not because I still got to fix everything.
Yeah.
So I was actually just about to jump into prioritization. And Vulcan, with what you were just saying, it sounds like exposure assessment, prioritization falls within that. Is that right?
Yeah. As part of the exposure assessment, you need to consider the prioritization.
Cecil's building out his exposure management program. So like, how would he go about thinking about, how does exposure assessment tie into what he does?
In my mind, assessment is find all the things, right? Start there. Now I found everything. Now I need context to prioritize and eliminate things. Actually, what we saw a lot of good programs did was, and a lot of this is dependent on the vendor itself, right? In terms of, like, we published a lot of joint reports with the Scientia Institute about all of the remediation activities going on across these organizations. And on average, they fix about 15 to 20% per month of their vulnerabilities, which means a lot of them are not being fixed. But we also saw, if you looked at by vendor, like, people were really good about fixing Chrome because everybody was just had it set to auto update, right? And while Microsoft was a little more difficult, people had really done a good job of operationalizing Patch Tuesday. Some of the more modern Microsoft versions of these operating systems actually did have auto update. So they would get to, let's say I had 1 million open vulnerabilities. I might be able to I'm just going to fix 300,000 every month, no matter what, because I've operationalized it. It's not like I'm going to deploy one Microsoft patch, but not the second one, right? I'm just going to do it. And then that reduces my pile. Now, this pile, I need to prioritize because it's a little bit more difficult. Well, what about my security controls, to Vulcan's point, right? What I invested in firewall, IPS, IDS, EDR, all of these things. Does that in any way either reduce the pile or at least change the order of the pile, right? And then I can start to look at exploit traffic and exploit availability and likelihood and all of that. Once I've reduced the pile down to the stuff that's, okay, this is all really hard to fix. So let's make sure that it's worth my time to do.
Ed, what you just mentioned in the last 2 minutes was a very difficult orchestra. There's so many pieces there. And I know there's CTEM is not just one product, but a suite of products and people and processes. And my question for you right now is, every CISO would ask you, hey, I need something better, something turnkey. Is there a turnkey solution for this?
My friends over at Picus would probably tell to talk to. So I don't know that I have not seen like there's one, here's the CTEM vendor that does all of this and takes care of all your control and everything else. I would say that there are organizations that do it better than others. And I would say even, we talked about asset management earlier, right? I remember, so we would connect into your CMDB, your asset management systems, pull a bunch of context out of there to understand, well, what are the business processes associated with it so we can help prioritize how important this asset is. And then we come back and we talk to the customer and they go, oh yeah, that's about 70% out of date. So I'm not going to say that there's a turnkey solution or it's out of the box. I do think everything is getting better, but we also have a long ways to go.
I would love to replace 3 technologies into 1 or 4 technologies.
Yes, I think there's a lot of CISOs out there that would say that right now.
Definitely we hear that one. And also we hear we want everything to be in a single console, but we need everything that for product has been doing in a single product. So that becomes mission impossible, right? So like every organization has different dynamics. So what we believe is that we are an open platform. We are collaborating with other vendors. So like an exposure assessment vendor or a vulnerability management vendor, a cyber attack surface management vendor, they need validation data. We are here to expose that one so that you have maybe in your vulnerability management tool, you have 400 clients of your users using this platform. You have multiple automated workflows. So you build that in a year time or 2 years time. So it's not like, hey, I love what you're doing, so I'm going to switch everything to that platform. It's like migrating from SAP to something else.
Some good news is I would certainly say over the last 10 years that it's gotten better in terms of vendors opening up their platforms and their data. So having APIs, being able to share data across these different tools to provide that context. So depending on my workflow and what job I'm trying to do, at least I can integrate those tools. There's still ways to go in my mind, and we're starting to see things like security data lakes that are coming up that are popular. We're starting to see, kind of like the I forget what they call them now, but basically this data mesh networks that these new vendors are coming up with, where they're basically integrating with all of the security tools for you, and then you're just plugging into one tool. That's helpful. It's not what you're asking for, CISO, but it's closer.
Right. No, and I understand. As a CISO, I like my team to be aided by a tool, preferably, or tools and processes, so they could make decisions on their own. I don't want them to talk, Cecil, do we fix this today? I don't want that question sent my way. I want them to make those decisions at their level. So, with the speed and velocity of vulnerabilities and exploitation, timing is really important. So I want them to make those decisions quickly with the aid of a tool or tools.
Vulcan is very polite and humble, but I gotta drop some facts about Picus real quick. I signed up to get a trial of the product, and it does a lot: security control validation, detection rule validation, cloud security validation, and then, but wait, there's more. There's a lot that Picus does, along with attack path validation, attack service validation. I was surprised with all the things that you could do within the platform. So I think that, consolidating down to one tool from dozens probably isn't possible. But like you were saying, can I go to 3? Can I go to 4 tools? I think that's what makes the journey a little bit easier when remediating 35 million vulnerabilities.
Definitely. What you need is, for exposure management, you need to definitely, we discussed about scoping, and you need to do exposure assessment. You put all your exposures in a list, and you need to prioritize them. While prioritizing, you need to look into your security controls. Looking your security controls means that you are overriding 4.2 CVSS score with a Picus score, because you have your EDR, your network security resilient with privilege escalation attacks or evasion techniques. So what does it mean? That not 9.4, 9.2, but it is 4.8. So 4.8 means that you don't need to fix that in the first week, but you have an SLA of 2 weeks. So that criticality score is helping you with that. What you also need is looking into the attack paths. So in terms of attack paths, you have 2 options. The first one is you can do a pen test automation. As Ron mentioned, we have attack path validation product. That's a pen test automation technology. You assume breach, you start a binary, an implant on an endpoint system, then you can see the path to your critical assets, like maybe a ransomware scenario or being a domain admin in your environment is the sum of the examples. So you can see the real attack paths in your environment. Or as Ed mentioned, we have a data fabric. So we pull in all the vulnerable scanner data, asset management data, the Picus findings, and we can build you attack paths in a simulated environment. So that gives you alternative paths on it. And on top of that, risk quantification. That is what we are also building. So the risk quantification means that we are giving you a dollar value of your risk. So you can see that if you change your firewall, how your risk volume will change. If you add more people to your patch management process, or you reduce the resources there, how your risk will going to change, and how the dollar value will be impacted, and all will be part of a risk dashboard.
Yeah, for sure. So what is exposure validation exactly, if you had to stitch it together in a few words?
For me, exposure validation is you have good number of exposures, and you want to focus on the signals, cutting the noise. Exposure validation is helping you to look at the opportunities in your environment, to deprioritize some of the exposures that are not pressing for you. so that with your limited resources and with the limited time you need to take an action on, you get the true list of exposures you need to act on. With exposure management, you have a lot findings compared to vulnerability management process. So you need to consider exposure validation when you are building your exposure management program from day one.
How is exposure validation different than breach and attack simulation?
I think that Vulcan was made to answer this question, so I'll let him answer.
Breach attack simulation is about validating your security controls. So you need to have an understanding how effective your preventive control and your detective controls are. It gives you a posture, your attack surface. That's awesome. But exposure validation is how you can mobilize your breach attack simulation visibility for your vulnerability management program. So you need to have the intelligence of assets. You need to understand the vulnerabilities so that you can map your control effectiveness data to assets and to vulnerabilities.
One of I think the things I hear the most is, all of these different data sources that you have to focus in on. When it comes to validating whether or not an exposure has been remedied, what do you need from your team to feel confident that the job is done?
Overall, I want them to have a process in place where we just do it day by day. I don't really like to have like a gates. Hey, Cecil, this is where we are. I want it like an well-oiled machine. Again, I'm always wishing a one tool, well-oiled machine. I'm hoping my team members are not listening here. They'll probably start leaving and looking for other jobs now.
If you were starting an exposure management program today, how would you go about it? What is your first action that you're going to take? Let's start with you, Ed.
I would start by assessing the processes that you already have in place, right? If you already got vulnerability assessment going on or vulnerability management, you might already have something going on with breach and attack simulation. You might have something going on with ASM and things like that. Grab everything that you already have and start to assess that and see how you can tie that together as a starting point, and then incrementally improve and expand upon it from there.
Honestly, we're already doing pieces of these. They're modular. I would love to stitch them together. I would love to have the automation as part of it. We have all these modular activities. Let's make it a program. That's why I called my project CTEM program implementation, because we got pieces of this, but they're not one process. They're separate processes.
Right. Which breaks the continuous piece.
Definitely process is important, and I believe organizations shouldn't do the heavy lifting. They need to define the process, coach the vendors or challenge the vendors to do that. When I see organizations motivated to write the middleware, I saw that with our CISO dashboard. They have their own internal dashboarding tools. What I see is that project is just canceled or archived or rewritten every other year because the guy who developed that dashboard left the company. So they cannot maintain that one. The next guy saying like, oh, this dashboard is crap. The code is not maintainable. So I'm going to start with another language because he's motivated for another language. So I guess building middleware kind of approaches is not scalable, and anchoring organizations to lots of limitations. I would say you define the process, you see how it's going to work, build your needs and your red lines, and push the vendors to see what they can do for you. And also look at the pickles, right? So we are doing great. This one, definitely.
Yeah.
That Ron, I guess that's what we are looking into. Hey, Volkan, tell something about pickles. Yeah, also look into. Yeah, we are doing a lot on this one. We are crazy about making a smooth journey. Cecil, like I love to catch up to expose ourselves what we are doing end to end. I hope we can address your use cases with Picos itself or with very limited vendors to cover it end to end.
Like Vulcan said, like Ed said, like Cecil's curious about, check out Pika Security. Be sure to drop over to pikasecurity.com, try out a demo, or speak to their team like Vulcan. Want to thank all three of you, Ed, Cecil, Vulcan, for taking some time out of your busy day to speak with me and also to speak with the audience about this awesome emerging subject of exposure validation and all that comes with it. So with that, we want to thank everyone for tuning in, and we will see everyone next time.